Jackson was once a lone survivor, fighting to stay alive in a brutal world. But after everything, can he find peace in the midst of the storm? An enigmatic woman, innocent children, and a journey that's no longer just about survival, but about rediscovering what truly matters. Will they find a place to call home in this wild, unforgiving world? Jackson and Kalia's story begins with life-or-death battles, but where will it end? Can they overcome all obstacles to build a family, or will they face even greater challenges ahead? Don't miss out on this emotional journey. Subscribe to the channel today to follow Jackson, Kalia, and the kids as they search for hope and peace. Join us in exploring a world filled with danger, but also love. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode of this incredible story. The jungle pressed in from all sides, a suffocating wall of green and shadow that swallowed the horizon whole. The air clung to Jackson's skin, thick and wet, a thin sheen of sweat that refused to dry even as the last echoes of rain faded into the undergrowth. Overhead, the canopy loomed dense and unyielding, a tangled mess of vines and broad leaves that choked out the light, leaving only slivers of pale gray to pierce the gloom. Somewhere in the dark, insects screeched, a relentless, piercing hum that drilled into his skull, buzzing like static against the silence of this alien world. The stench hit him next, rotting earth, damp and sour, mingling with the decaying musk of fallen leaves and the sharp tang of moisture that hung heavy after the storm. It coated his lungs with every breath, a bitter reminder that this wasn't Earth, wasn't home. Jackson moved slow, deliberate, boots sinking into the soft, muddy ground with each step. The damp seeped through the worn leather, soaking his socks, chilling his toes until they ached. His uniform, what was left of it, hung in tatters, the gray fabric torn at the shoulders and chest, stained dark with sweat and streaks of black soil. The weight of the plasma pistol sat heavy in his grip, its cold metal a lifeline, the only piece of the wreckage he'd managed to salvage. His other hand brushed against his thigh, fingers twitching toward the knife strapped there, a reflex born from too many nights spent waiting for something to lunge from the shadows. Sweat trickled down his spine, pooling at the small of his back, slick and uncomfortable under the remnants of his flight jacket. He'd been walking for hours, days, maybe, searching for any sign of the crew, any flicker of human life amid the endless green. But there was nothing. No voices, no signals, just the jungle and its ceaseless, mocking quiet. He stopped, chest heaving, and wiped a forearm across his brow. The salt stung his eyes, blurring his vision for a moment before he blinked it away. His gaze swept the surroundings, sharp, cold, a predator's stare honed by years of survival. The crash had taken everything. The ship, the team, the mission. He'd crawled from the twisted metal alone, ears ringing with the memory of screams and the roar of engines tearing apart. Now it was just him, alone, exhausted, but alive. That was the human in him, the stubborn spark that refused to flicker out even when the odds stacked higher than the trees around him. He adjusted his grip on the pistol, the hum of its power cell faint but steady against his palm. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The silence broke, an abrupt, jagged sound that sliced through the drone of the jungle. A scream, small, desperate, unmistakably a child's. Jackson froze, every muscle locking tight, breath catching in his throat. His head snapped toward the noise, ears straining as it came again, fainter this time, but closer than he'd expected. His heart kicked hard against his ribs, not from fear but from something else, something older, deeper. Instinct. He shifted his weight, mud sucking at his boots as he turned, pistol raised, and started toward it. The ground sloped downward, slippery with wet moss and loose dirt, forcing him to brace against a gnarled root that jutted from the earth like a twisted hand. His fingers dug into the rough bark, feeling the damp grit under his nails as he steadied himself. The scream wasn't alone now. There were voices, low and guttural, layered with menace. Not human. Something else. He pushed forward, weaving through the underbrush, branches snagging at his arms, and scraping his skin raw. The air grew thicker, heavier with the scent of sap and something metallic blood. Maybe. His pulse quickened, a steady thrum in his ears as he crested a low rise and saw them. Below, in a shallow clearing ring by towering ferns, stood a woman. Her skin shimmered faintly, a pale violet that caught the dim light like wet stone, streaked with mud and sweat that glistened on her arms and neck. Long black hair spilled wild over her shoulders, matted with dampness, clinging to her face in dark, heavy strands. She was tall, lean, her frame taut with defiance as she planted herself between two small figures, children, in a pack of hulking shapes that circled her like wolves. The hunters were massive, their gray skin rough and scarred, claws glinting as they flexed their hands. Their eyes glowed a sickly yellow, locked on her with predatory glee. Jackson crouched low, breath shallow, assessing. The woman, Kalia, he'd learn later, held no weapon, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The children pressed close, tiny hands clutching at the tattered hem of her cloak, their wide eyes darting between her and the hunters. One, a boy, barely reached her waist, his face smeared with dirt. The other, a girl, clung tighter, her trembling frame almost hidden behind the woman's legs. The hunters snarled, their voices a guttural rasp that rumbled through the clearing. One stepped forward, towering over her, its jagged teeth bared in a grin. Soft prey, it growled, the sound thick and wet. No fight left in you. Kalia didn't flinch. Her chest rose and fell hard, sweat beading on her brow, but her gaze stayed steady, fierce. Then she spoke, her voice cutting through the air like a blade, sharp and unwavering despite the odds. "My children are obedient," she said, turning her head just enough to catch Jackson's eye where he crouched in the shadows. "I can be a good wife to you, stranger." The words hit him like a shockwave, not a plea but a gambit, raw and deliberate. Her eyes, deep violet, burning with something between desperation and cunning, locked onto his, piercing through the distance. It wasn't surrender. It was a challenge, a dare wrapped in the promise of alliance. Jackson felt a jolt, a heat that flared low in his gut and raced up his spine. Not from a danger, not from the hunters closing in, but from her. The way she stood, unbowed, her body tense but alive with a wild, untamed strength. The sweat on her skin caught the faint light, tracing the curve of her collarbone, the line of her jaw. His grip tightened on the pistol, knuckles whitening as he processed her words. She didn't know him, didn't even know if he'd help, yet she'd thrown that line like a lifeline, or a trap. His lips twitched, the ghost of smirk. Smart. Damn smart. The lead hunter laughed, a wet, ugly sound that snapped Jackson back to the moment. "Wife?" It mocked, reaching for her with a clawed hand. "You'll fetch a price, broken or not." Its fingers grazed her arm, and she jerked back, shoving the children behind her with a hiss. That was it, Jackson's cue. He rose from his crouch, pistol steady, and squeezed the trigger. The plasma bolt tore through the air, a streak of blue fire that punched through the hunter's chest. It staggered, choking on its own blood, then crumpled into the mud with a dull thud. The others spun toward him, snarling, but he was already moving, boots pounding the wet earth, adrenaline surging hot through his veins. The clearing erupted, claws slashing, plasma sizzling, the sharp crack of gunfire echoing off the trees. Jackson ducked a swipe, felt the air hiss past his ear, and fired again, dropping another hunter mid-lunge. Kalia didn't freeze either. She darted low, snatching a fallen branch, its end jagged and sharp, and drove it into the leg of a third. The creature roared, stumbling, and Jackson finished it with a shot to the skull. The last one charged him, too fast, too close. He dropped the pistol, yanked his knife free, and met it head-on. Their bodies collided, a tangle of muscle and fury, his blade sinking deep into its gut as its claws raked his shoulder, hot pain flaring down his arm. When it fell, silence crashed back in, heavy and sudden. Jackson stood there, chest heaving, blood dripping from his knife onto the mud. His eyes flicked to Kalia. She was breathing hard, the branch still clutched in her hands, knuckles pale against the wood. Sweat streaked her face, sliding down her neck, pooling in the hollow of her throat. Her gaze met his again, intense, unreadable, but alive with something that made his pulse hammer harder. The children peeked out from behind her, wide-eyed but unharmed. "You're safe now," he said, voice rough, wiping the blade clean on his sleeve. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched him. The air between them thickened, charged with something unspoken. Jackson stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat radiating off her, to see the faint tremble in her hands. His fingers brushed her arm, accidental, testing, her skin cool and slick under his touch. She tensed but didn't pull away. Neither did he. The clearing was a blur of motion and sound, a chaotic symphony of death unfolding beneath the jungle's oppressive canopy. Jackson didn't hesitate. Hesitation was a luxury he'd lost long ago, somewhere between the crash and the endless nights of running. The plasma pistol bucked in his hand, its hum spiking into a sharp whine as he fired. A bolt of searing blue light ripped through the mist, punching into the chest of the nearest hunter. The creature's roar cut off mid-breath, replaced by a wet gurgle as it staggered, gray skin sizzling where the shot burned through. It hit the mud face first, claws twitching once before going still. Jackson was already moving, boots slamming into the damp earth, adrenaline flooding his veins like liquid fire. His muscles strained under the soaked fabric of his uniform, the wet cloth clinging tight to his arms and chest, outlining every tense flex as he darted to the side. Another hunter lunged, claws slashing through the air where his head had been a heartbeat before. He felt the rush of wind, the faint sting of displaced mist against his cheek, and pivoted hard, firing again. The second bolt caught it mid-stride, tearing through its throat in a spray of dark blood that spattered the ferns. It collapsed with a pained bellow, limbs thrashing in the muck, but Jackson didn't stop to watch. His eyes flicked to the remaining threats, two more, their yellow eyes narrowing as they adjusted, spreading out to flank him. They were fast, smarter than he'd expected, their guttural snarls vibrating through the humid air. He gritted his teeth, sweat dripping into his eyes, stinging sharp. His shoulder throbbed where the last one had clawed him, but he shoved the pain down, burying it under the raw need to survive. Then he saw her, Plea. She wasn't cowering, wasn't frozen like some prey waiting for the end. She moved, quick and sure, bending low to snatch a jagged branch from the ground. The wood was slick with moss, its splintered end gleaming wet in the dim light, and she gripped it like a spear. One of the hunters turned toward her, its massive frame lumbering closer, claws raised to strike. Jackson's breath caught, but before he could aim, she struck first. With a cry that was half defiance, half fury, she drove the branch into its leg, the point sinking deep into the meat of its thigh. The creature howled, stumbling, its weight crashing against a fern as it tried to pull free. Jackson didn't waste the opening. He squeezed the trigger, and the plasma bolt slammed into its skull, bursting through in a flash of blue and red. It dropped, silent, the branch still jutting from its leg like a grim trophy. The last hunter roared, charging him head-on, too close for another shot. Jackson dropped the pistol, its weight useless now, and yanked the knife from his thigh strap in one fluid motion. The creature hit him like a wall, all muscle and rage, its claws raking his arm as they collided. Pain flared, hot and bright, but he twisted, using its momentum against it. His blade flashed, sinking deep into its gut, and he drove it upward, feeling the resistance of flesh give way. Warm blood spilled over his hand, slick and sticky, mixing with the mud on his skin as the hunter gurgled, slumping against him. He shoved it off, letting it crumple into the dirt, and stood there, chest heaving, knife dripping crimson onto the ground. Silence fell, sudden and heavy, broken only by the rasp of his own breathing and the distant hum of the jungle. Jackson wiped his brow with the back of his hand, smearing blood and sweat across his face, and turned. Plea stood a few paces away, the branch still clutched tight in her hands, its tip stained dark with the hunter's blood. Her chest rose and fell hard, each breath pushing against the thin, torn fabric of her cloak, outlining the curve of her ribs. Sweat streaked her violet skin, glistening as it traced a slow path down her neck, dripping into the hollow of her throat, then sliding further to catch in the dip above her collarbone. Her hair clung to her face in damp strands, framing those fierce, unyielding eyes, deep violet, alive with something raw and untamed. The children huddled behind her, safe, their small hands gripping her legs, but it was her Jackson couldn't look away from. He stepped forward, boots squelching in the mud, the air between them thick with the aftermath of violence, and something else, something electric. His breath came heavy, hot, and as he closed the distance, it brushed her face, stirring a loose strand of her hair. She didn't flinch, didn't step back, just watched him with that piercing gaze, her lips parting slightly as if to speak, but holding back. He stopped close, too close, maybe, his chest nearly brushing hers, the heat of his body radiating against the cool dampness of her skin. "You hurt?" he asked, voice rough, low, the words scraping out of his throat. His eyes flicked over her, searching for wounds, lingering a moment too long on the way her cloak clung to her shoulders, the fabric dark and wet against her curves. Kalia shook her head, a small, sharp motion, but her hands trembled faintly around the branch. Jackson reached out, instinct overriding thought, his fingers grazing her arm where the hunter had grabbed her. Her skin was cool under his touch, slick with sweat and mud, but soft, impossibly soft beneath the grime. The contact sent a jolt through him, a spark that tightened his gut and quickened his pulse. She stiffened, her breath hitching, but she didn't pull away. His thumb brushed higher, tracing the line of her forearm, feeling the faint shiver that ran through her. Her eyes locked onto his, wide and searching, a silent question hanging between them. His hand lingered, the heat of his palm pressing against her, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just that, the feel of her under his fingers, the way her chest rose faster now, matching his own. "You fought," he said, breaking the silence, his voice still rough but softer now, almost a growl. "Not bad." A faint smirk tugged at his lips, testing her, pushing at the tension coiling tight in the air. Kalia's mouth twitched, the barest hint of a response, but her gaze didn't waver. "You killed them," she countered, her voice low, steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Not bad." He let his hand drop, but not before his fingers brushed down her arm one last time, slow, deliberate, feeling the texture of her skin shift under his touch. She exhaled, a sharp, quiet sound, and he stepped back, just enough to breathe, to think. The children stirred behind her, the boy peeking out first, his wide eyes darting between them. Jackson straightened, wiping his knife on his sleeve, the blood smearing into the fabric. "Name's Jackson," he said, meeting her gaze again, his tone firm but laced with something warmer now. "You, Kalia," she answered, her voice carrying that same edge of defiance. But her eyes didn't leave his, not for a second. It was a challenge, a tether, like she was daring him to stay, to prove he was more than just a stranger who'd stumbled into her fight. He felt it, that pull, sharp and undeniable, tugging at something deep in his chest. The jungle pressed in around them, the air thick with mist and the fading stench of death. But here, in this moment, it was just them, two survivors staring down the void together. The boy, Tavi, he'd learn later, shifted closer to Kalia, his small hand tugging at her cloak. "Are they gone?" he whispered, voice small but steady. Jackson glanced down, softening just enough to nod. "Yeah, kid, they're gone." He looked back at Kalia, catching the way her shoulders eased, the faintest crack in her armor as she let the branch slip from her grip, hitting the mud with a soft thud. Her fingers flexed, empty now, and Jackson's own hand twitched, resisting the urge to reach for her again. They weren't safe, not really. The jungle was still out there, vast and hungry, and the hunters could have kin lurking in the shadows. But for now, the threat was dead at their feet, and that was enough. Jackson slung the pistol back into its holster, the weight grounding him, and met Kalia's eyes one more time. "We need to move," he said, the words a quiet command. She nodded, slow, deliberate, and gathered the children close. As they turned to leave the clearing, his hand brushed her back, just a fleeting touch, steadying her against the uneven ground. She tensed, then relaxed into it, and Jackson felt that heat flare again, simmering low, promising more than either of them was ready to name. The jungle didn't relent. It stretched ahead, endless and unyielding, a labyrinth of twisted roots and dripping leaves that swallowed every step Jackson took. The air hung heavy, thick with moisture that coated his skin, his torn uniform sticking to his chest and thighs like a second layer of flesh. His boots sank into the muddy earth, each lift a struggle against the suction of the wet ground, the cold seeping through to numb his feet. The plasma pistol hung at his hip, its weight a constant reminder of the danger still lurking in the shadows, while the knife at his thigh pressed against his leg, cool and reassuring. Sweat stung his eyes, mixing with the blood drying on his arm from the fight. But he pushed forward, carving a path through the underbrush with the focus of a man who'd learned to keep moving no matter the cost. Kalia followed close, her steps lighter but no less determined, the children, Tavi and Mina, clinging to her sides. Her cloak dragged in the mud, the hem frayed and heavy with dampness, but she didn't falter. Her violet skin shimmered faintly under the streaks of dirt and sweat, her long black hair swaying with each movement, strands sticking to her neck and shoulders. Jackson glanced back once, catching the way her jaw tightened, her eyes scanning the trees with the same wariness he felt. They hadn't spoken much since the clearing, just enough to agree they couldn't stay, but the silence between them wasn't empty. It crackled, alive with the memory of her words, her touch, the heat that had flared when his fingers brushed her arm. The ground dipped suddenly, sloping toward a shallow stream that cut through the jungle like a vein of ice. The water rushed low and fast, its surface glinting under the faint light that pierced the canopy, cold enough to bite. Jackson stepped in first, wincing as the chill surged past his knees, soaking his pants and sending a shiver up his spine. The current tugged at him, steady but insistent, and he braced against it, turning to offer a hand. "Careful," he said, voice rough, his breath misting in the damp air. Kalia nodded, guiding Tavi and Mina ahead of her, their small feet splashing as they waded through, clutching her cloak for balance. She came last, stepping into the stream with a sharp intake of breath, the cold hitting her hard. Her foot slipped on a slick stone, and she stumbled, arms flailing for a moment before Jackson moved. His hand shot out, catching her by the waist, fingers digging into the wet fabric of her cloak. The material was thin, soaked through, and beneath it, he felt the tension of her body, the way her muscles tightened under his grip. Her warmth seeped through, a stark contrast to the icy waters swirling around them, and it burned into his palms, spreading up his arms like a current of its own. She steadied herself, hands gripping his shoulders, her nails pressing into the damp fabric of his jacket. Their eyes met, hers wide, violet flickering with surprise, and for a heartbeat, they were locked there, chest to chest, the rush of the stream fading to a dull roar. "You good?" he asked, voice low, his breath brushing her cheek. She nodded, lips parting as she exhaled, the warmth of it grazing his skin. His hands lingered, thumbs pressing lightly against her sides, feeling the faint rise and fall of her breathing. Her cloak clung to her, outlining the curve of her hips, and Jackson's pulse kicked harder, a steady thrum he couldn't ignore. She didn't pull away, not yet, just held his gaze, her fingers tightening on his shoulders before she finally stepped back, breaking the contact. The cold rushed in where her warmth had been, and he let his hands drop, flexing them against the ache left behind. They crossed the stream in silence, the children shivering as they climbed the far bank, mud streaking their legs. Jackson led them deeper, the jungle closing in again, until the light began to fade, swallowed by the thickening canopy. Hours bled into each other, the ache in his legs growing sharper, the weight of exhaustion pressing down. He found it finally, a shallow cave carved into a rocky outcrop, its mouth half hidden by vines. The air inside was stale, cool, a reprieve from the suffocating humidity outside. "Here," he said, gesturing with a tilt of his head. Kalia ushered Tavi and Mina in first, then followed, her silhouette sharp against the dim glow as she ducked under the low entrance. Jackson crouched near the center, pulling a small fire starter from his pack, a battered thing, scavenged from the wreck. Sparks flared, catching on a pile of dry moss and twigs he'd gathered, and soon a small flame flickered to life, casting dancing shadows across the cave walls. The light spilled over Kalia's face, painting her features in gold and shadow. High cheekbones, full lips, those piercing violet eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. She sat close, too close maybe, her knees brushing his as she settled the children against her. Tavi nestled in her side, Mina curling up with her head in Kalia's lap, their breathing slowing as the warmth seeped in. He noticed it then, a gash on her shoulder, shallow but raw, blood crusting along the edge where her cloak had torn. "You're hurt," he said, reaching into his pack for the medkit, his voice gruff but steady. She glanced at the wound, then at him, hesitating before giving a small nod. "It's nothing," she murmured, but she didn't stop him as he shifted closer, the heat of the fire warming his back. He dampened a cloth with water from his canteen, his fingers brushing her shoulder as he peeled the fabric aside. Her skin was cool, slick with sweat, and he pressed the cloth gently against the cut, wiping away the dirt and blood. She tensed, a soft hiss escaping her lips, and he paused, meeting her eyes. "Stings?" he asked, keeping his tone even. "Not the wound," she said, quieter now, her gaze flickering to his hand. He swallowed, feeling the weight of her words, the way her breath hitched as his fingers slid along her shoulder, tracing the edge of the gash. The firelight danced over her skin, highlighting the faint shimmer of her violet hue, and he worked slow, deliberate, his thumb grazing the soft curve above her collarbone as he cleaned the cut. Her lips parted, eyes half closing. Not from pain, he realized, but from the closeness, the heat of his breath fanning across her neck as he leaned in to tie the bandage. His fingers lingered, pressing the knot secure, and he felt her pulse jump under his touch, fast and unsteady. "Better?" he asked, voice low, rougher than he meant it to be. She nodded, her throat moving as she swallowed, and he pulled back, just enough to breathe, to think, but his hand didn't retreat far. It slid down, resting on her knee as he steadied himself against the cave floor, the fabric of her cloak damp under his palm. She didn't push him away, didn't flinch, but her body stiffened, her breathing quickening in a way that mirrored his own. Tavi stirred, blinking up at them, his small voice breaking the silence. "What happened to your ship?" he asked, curious, innocent. Jackson exhaled, glancing at the boy, grateful for the distraction. "Crashed," he said, keeping it short, his voice a low rumble. "It's something bad up there. Only me left." His hand stayed on Kalia's knee, fingers tightening slightly, and she didn't move, just watched him as he spoke. Mina lifted her head, sleepy but listening. "Were you scared?" she whispered. Jackson smirked, faint but real. Not enough to stop. The kid settled back, reassured, and he felt Kalia's gaze shift, heavy on him now. "They cast me out," she said suddenly, her voice soft but sharp, cutting through the quiet. He looked at her, waiting, his thumb brushing absently over her knee, a small, unconscious motion that made her breath catch again. "My husband died. A warrior. They wanted me to take another, to stay useful. I refused." Her eyes darkened, staring into the fire. "They called me broken, astray. Said I couldn't raise them alone." She nodded toward Tavi and Mina, her hand resting protectively on their heads. Jackson's jaw tightened, his grip on her knee firming, grounding her as much as himself. "They're wrong," he said, voice hard, certain. "You're not broken. You're here." Her gaze snapped to his, searching, and for a moment, The cave felt smaller, the air thicker. His hand stayed where it was, the warmth of her seeping through the damp cloth, and she leaned closer, just a fraction, enough for him to feel the shift, the unspoken pull. "You're here too," she murmured, and the words hung between them, heavy with meaning they weren't ready to unpack. The fire crackled, the jungle humming beyond the cave walls, but inside, it was just them, Jackson, Plea, and the fragile thread of something building in the dark. The jungle shifted as night fell, its oppressive weight softening into a quieter menace. The air grew cooler, heavy with the scent of damp earth and the faint, sour tang of a nearby swamp. Jackson led the way, his boots crunching over fallen twigs and sinking into patches of soft mud, the plasma pistol a steady weight at his hip. His shoulder ached where the hunter's claws had torn into him, a dull throb that pulsed with every step, but he ignored it, his focus split between the path ahead and the trio behind him. Plea kept pace, her movements fluid despite the exhaustion etching lines into her face. Tavi and Mina trailing close, their small hands gripping her cloak. The fire in the cave had bought them a few hours of rest, but staying still too long wasn't an option. Not with the jungle alive around them, its shadows hiding threats he couldn't yet see. They reached the edge of a sprawling bog, the ground giving way to a stretch of dark water dotted with gnarled roots and clumps of moss. The moon, pale and fractured through the canopy, cast a silver glow over the scene, turning the surface into a mirror of shimmering light. Jackson stopped, scanning the expanse, his breath misting in the chilly air. "We'll camp here," he said, voice low, nodding toward a cluster of low rocks near the water's edge. The spot was defensible, open enough to see trouble coming, sheltered enough to rest. Plea didn't argue, just guided the children to the rocks, her cloak dragging wet streaks across the ground. Jackson dropped his pack, pulling out the fire starter again. The sparks caught fast on a pile of dry reeds he'd scavenged, and soon a small flame flickered to life, its warmth pushing back the damp cold. He sat back, stretching his legs out, the ache in his muscles easing as the heat seeped in. Plea settled across from him, the firelight dancing over her violet skin, catching the sheen of sweat still clinging to her neck and arms. Her hair fell loose, dark strands framing her face, and she pulled his jacket tighter around her shoulders. Too big, the sleeves swallowing her hands, but she hadn't taken it off since he'd handed it to her in the cave. Tavi and Mina curled up beside her, their small forms huddling under a thin blanket, eyes heavy with sleep. For a while, there was just the crackle of the fire and the distant croak of something unseen in the swamp. Jackson leaned back against a rock, his gaze drifting to the flames, but he felt her watching him, those violet eyes sharp, unreadable, cutting through the quiet. He met her stare, holding it, and something shifted in the air, a pull he'd felt growing since the clearing, stronger now in the stillness. "You should sleep," he said, breaking the silence, his voice rough but soft, meant only for her. She tilted her head, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "I should," she agreed, but she didn't move, just sat there, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around herself, the jacket slipping slightly to reveal the curve of her shoulder. A gust of wind swept through, stirring the fire and sending a shiver through her. She pulled the jacket closer, fingers curling into the fabric, and Jackson shifted, moving to her side of the fire without a word. He sat close, closer than he had in the cave, his knee brushing hers, the heat of his body cutting through the chill. "Cold?" he asked, voice low, his breath brushing her ear as he leaned in. She shook her head, but her shiver betrayed her, and he reached out, his hand hovering over her arm before settling there, firm, steady. Her skin was cool under his palm, damp from the night air, and he felt the faint tremor that ran through her. Not from the cold, he knew, but from him. "You're warm," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes flicking to his hand, then back to his face. He smirked, faint but real. "Human thing." His fingers tightened slightly, thumb tracing a slow line along her arm, feeling the texture of her skin shift under his touch. She didn't pull away, just watched him, her breath catching as his hand slid higher, brushing the edge of the jacket where it met her neck. The firelight played over her face, highlighting the way her lips parted, the faint flush creeping up her throat. His pulse kicked harder, a steady drumbeat he couldn't quiet, and he leaned closer, his shoulder pressing against hers, the heat of their bodies mingling in the narrow space between them. "I've lost people too," he said suddenly, his voice rougher now, the words spilling out like they'd been waiting. "Crew. Friends. Watch them burn up in that crash." He stared into the fire, his hand still on her arm, fingers flexing against her. "Kept going 'cause I had to. Didn't think there'd be anything else." Her gaze softened, searching his face, and she shifted, her knee pressing harder against his. "My people didn't burn," she said, her tone steady but laced with something raw. "They just turned away. Left me to rot because I wouldn't bend." Her fingers brushed his jacket, lingering there, and he felt the weight of her words, the echo of his own scars in them. "You didn't rot," he said, turning to her, his voice hard, certain. "You fought. You're still here." His hand slid up, cupping her shoulder, pulling her just a fraction closer. Her breath hitched, warm against his cheek, and she leaned in, her forehead nearly touching his. "So are you," she whispered, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, tugging lightly, testing. The air thickened, charged with the unspoken, and Jackson's hand moved, slow, deliberate, sliding to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her damp hair. Her scalp was warm under his touch, her pulse racing beneath his thumb as it brushed the soft skin behind her ear. She closed the distance first, her lips brushing his, tentative a question. He answered, pressing back, the kiss deepening fast, hungry but careful, like they were both afraid it'd break. Her mouth was soft, warm, tasting faintly of salt and the jungle's bitterness, and he groaned low in his throat, his hand tightening in her hair. She shifted, her body turning into his, her chest pressing against his as her hands slid up his arms, nails grazing his skin through the torn fabric. His free hand found her waist, pulling her closer, fingers digging into the damp cloak, feeling the heat of her beneath it. The kiss was a spark igniting, a release of everything they'd held back. The fight, the fear, the pull. And it burned through them, fierce and alive. They broke apart, breaths ragged, foreheads resting together, the fire's warmth a faint echo of the heat between them. Her fingers stayed on his arms, trembling slightly, and his hand lingered on her waist, thumb brushing the curve of her hip. "Reckless," she whispered, a breathless laugh slipping out, her lips brushing his as she spoke. He smirked, voice hoarse. "Stubborn." She laughed again, soft and real, and the sound hit him hard, settling deep in his chest. The moment shattered with a low hum, distant, mechanical, growing louder. Jackson tensed, pulling back, his hand dropping to the pistol as his eyes scanned the dark. Kalia froze, her breath catching, and he stood, pulling her up with him, his grip firm on her arm. "Skiffs," he muttered, recognizing the sound. Engines, fast and closing in. The swamp lit up with streaks of light, cutting through the mist, and he cursed under his breath. Hunters. More of them, drawn by the fight or the fire, he didn't know. "Kids, hide," Kalia snapped, shoving Tavi and Mina behind the rocks, her voice sharp but calm. Jackson stepped in front of her, pistol raised, his body shielding hers as the first skiff broke through the trees, its thrusters roaring. Plasma fire erupted, bolts scorching the ground, and he returned fire, dropping the driver with a clean shot. The skiff spun, crashing into the water with a spray of mud. But more came, their lights blinding. Kalia grabbed a rock, hurling it at a hunter, leaping from the second skiff, and Jackson tackled another, his knife sinking into its chest. They fought back to back, her shoulder pressed against his, her breath hot on his neck as she swung again. A bolt grazed his arm, searing pain flaring, and he grunted, shoving her down behind a rock as another shot burned past. "Stay low," he growled, firing again, taking out the last skiff's gunner. The silence returned, heavy and sudden, the swamp littered with bodies and smoking wrecks. Jackson turned, pulling Kalia up, his hands gripping her arms, checking her fast. "You hit," he rasped, fingers sliding down her sides, feeling for blood, his touch urgent, possessive. She shook her head, breathless, her hands clutching his shirt. "You—" He ignored the burn on his arm, pulling her close, his forehead against hers again. "I'm fine," he lied, his voice rough, his hands tightening on her. Her fingers dug into his chest, grounding him. And for a moment, they just stood there, the swamp quiet around them, the fire still burning low. The spark had ignited, and it wasn't going out. The swamp faded behind them as dawn broke, a pale gray light seeping through the jungle's canopy, turning the mist into a shimmering haze. Jackson led the way, his boots crunching over damp leaves and snapping twigs, the plasma pistol still warm from the fight, its barrel faintly smoking at his hip. His arm burned where the bolt had grazed him, a sharp sting that pulsed with every step, but he kept moving, jaw tight, eyes scanning the trees. The adrenaline from the skiff attack lingered, a low hum in his veins, mixing with the heat still simmering from Kalia's touch, her kiss, the way her hands had clung to him in the chaos. She walked close behind, her breath steady but quick, Tavi and Mina clutching her cloak, their small faces pale but resolute. The jungle wasn't done with him yet. He could feel it, but they were close now, close to something better. The terrain shifted, the ground rising into a rocky incline dotted with sparse, twisted trees. Jackson slowed, catching the faint hum of machinery ahead, a sound that didn't belong to the wild. He crested the rise, and there it was, a settlement carved from the wreckage of a crashed colony ship, its hull repurposed into jagged walls of steel. Towers rose from the perimeter, their searchlights cutting through the dawn haze, sweeping the barren land beyond. Smoke curled from chimneys, the sharp tang of burning fuel mixing with the jungle's damp musk. It wasn't pretty, scarred metal, patched up defenses, a patchwork of survival, but it was human. Jackson felt a flicker of something in his chest, not quite relief, but close. A chance. He turned, meeting Kalia's gaze. Her violet eyes narrowed, taking in the settlement, her lips pressing into a thin line. Her cloak hung heavy with mud, the jacket he'd given her still draped over her shoulders, and he saw the tension in her frame, the way her fingers tightened on Tavi's hand, the faint tremble she tried to hide. "That's it," he said, voice low, steady. "Safe. For now." She didn't respond, just studied the walls, the lights, the distant figures moving within. He stepped closer, his hand brushing her arm, a quiet reassurance. Her skin was cool under his fingers, damp from the night, and she glanced at him, her expression unreadable but softer than before. "They'll take us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, laced with doubt. "They'll take me," he said, his grip firming on her arm, pulling her just a fraction closer. "And you're with me." His thumb brushed her sleeve, feeling the warmth beneath, and her breath hitched, her eyes locking onto his. For a moment, the jungle faded, the hum, the danger, the weight of it all, and it was just them standing there, tethered by that promise. She nodded, slow, and he let his hand drop, turning back to lead them down the slope. The gates loomed ahead, massive slabs of scavenged steel bolted together, scarred by years of wear. Jackson raised a hand as they approached, signaling the watchtowers. The lights paused, then swung away, and the gates groaned open, revealing the settlement beyond. Inside, the air buzzed with life, metal clanging as workers hammered at repairs, the low murmur of voices, the sharp scent of oil and cooking fires. People moved through the narrow streets, some armed, some hauling crates, all of them hardened by the same relentless world Jackson knew too well. A few glanced their way, eyes narrowing at Kalia's violet skin, her alien presence, but no one stopped them. Not yet. A woman approached, her dark hair pulled tight, her reinforced jacket patched with metal plates. She carried a rifle slung across her back, her gaze sharp as it flicked over Jackson, then Kalia and the kids. "You're back," she said, her voice clipped, recognizing him. "Thought you were Ash after that crash." Jackson smirked, faint but real. "Takes more than that." He stepped forward, positioning himself slightly ahead of Kalia, his shoulder brushing hers. A subtle claim. "They're with me. Need shelter." The woman's eyes lingered on Kalia, taking in her mud-streaked cloak, the way Tavi and Mina clung to her, then back to Jackson. "We don't take freeloaders," she said, her tone flat, testing. Kalia stiffened, her hand tightening on Mina's, but Jackson cut in before she could speak. "They're not," he said, voice hard, unyielding. "She fights. Kids are tough. They'll pull their weight." His hand found Kalia's back, resting there, fingers pressing lightly against the damp fabric, feeling the tension in her spine. The woman raised a brow, assessing, then nodded. "Fine. You vouch they stay. Get him settled." She turned, gesturing for them to follow, and Jackson let his hand slide down Kalia's back, guiding her forward. The contact was brief but deliberate, his palm lingering at the small of her back, the warmth of her seeping through the cloak. She glanced at him, her breath quickening, but she didn't pull away, just kept walking, her shoulder brushing his as they moved deeper into the settlement. The streets were a maze of repurposed holes and crates, children darting past with shouts, their laughter a stark contrast to the silence they'd left behind. Tavi tugged at Kalia's cloak, pointing at a group of kids kicking a makeshift ball, his eyes wide with curiosity. Mina stayed closer, her small hand gripping Kalia's, but even she looked up, taking it in. They reached a small structure near the edge, a storage unit turned living space, its walls dented but solid, a faint warmth spilling from the open door. The woman nodded toward it. "Yours for now. Rest. Work starts tomorrow." She left without another word, her boots echoing on the metal ground. Jackson stepped inside first, scanning the cramped space. 2 cots, a table, a flickering light overhead. It wasn't much, but it was dry, safe, a world away from the jungle's claws. He turned, watching as Kalia ushered the kids in, her movements slow, cautious, like she didn't trust the stillness. Tavi and Mina climbed onto one cot, their small forms sinking into the thin mattress, exhaustion finally winning. Kalia stood at the doorway, arms crossed, her gaze drifting over the settlement through the crack in the door. Jackson moved her side, close enough to feel the heat radiating off her, the faint tremble in her frame. "You okay?" he asked, voice low, his breath brushing her ear. She didn't answer right away, just stared out at the lights, the people, the life she hadn't expected to find. "I don't know how to stop waiting," she said finally, her voice soft, fragile. "For it to break." He exhaled, his hand finding hers, fingers brushing her knuckles before sliding over them, cool against his warmth. "Maybe it won't," he said, turning her to face him. Her eyes met his, wide, searching, and he stepped closer, his chest nearly touching hers, his hand tightening on hers. "You're not alone anymore." His voice was rough, certain, and he felt her fingers curl into his, hesitant at first, then firm. Her breath hitched, warm against his jaw, and she leaned in, just enough for him to feel the shift, the weight of her trust settling between them. She pulled back, glancing at the kids, then at him, a flicker of something softer in her eyes. "You're certain?" she asked, her voice different now, quieter, almost hopeful. He looked at her, really looked, taking in the mud on her face, the strength in her stance, the way she'd fought beside him. "Yeah," he said, his thumb brushing her hand, a slow, steady promise. "I'm certain." She held his gaze a moment longer, then stepped inside, her fingers slipping from his but leaving a warmth that lingered. Jackson stayed at the door, rifle resting against his leg, his eyes on the settlement. The jungle loomed beyond the walls, vast and hungry, but here, in this battered refuge, there was something new, a chance, a beginning. He felt Kalia's presence behind him, solid, real, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the urge to run. The weight of her hand in his, the heat of her beside him, it anchored him, a tether to something he hadn't known he'd been chasing. The sun dipped low over the settlement, painting the sky in streaks of amber and gold, a rare beauty against the jagged steel walls. The air cooled as evening settled in, carrying the faint hum of voices and the crackle of communal fires from the center of the outpost. Smoke curled upward, mingling with the sharp scent of metal and the softer aroma of bread baking somewhere nearby, a stark contrast to the jungle's damp rot. Jackson stood near the edge of their small dwelling, his rifle resting against the doorframe, its weight a familiar comfort even now. His arms still ached from the graze, the bandage Plea had tied tight around it pulling slightly as he flexed his hand, but the pain was duller now, fading like the chaos they'd left behind. Inside, Tavi and Mina giggled, their small voices bouncing off the dented walls. Jackson glanced back, catching the sight of them sprawled on the cot, wrestling over a scrap of cloth they'd turned into a toy. Their faces were cleaner now, the mud scrubbed away by Plea's careful hands, and their eyes shone with a lightness he hadn't seen in the jungle. Plea knelt beside them, her cloak discarded, replaced by a worn shirt one of the settlers had given her. It hung loose on her frame, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, exposing the violet shimmer of her skin. Her hair fell over one shoulder, dark and tangled, and she smiled, a small, real smile, as she tugged the cloth from Tavi's grip, holding it high until Mina tackled her with a laugh. Jackson leaned against the door, arms crossed, watching them. The sound of their laughter hit him hard, settling deep in his chest, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Not since the crash, not since the endless nights of running. He'd spent so long moving, fighting, surviving, that this quiet, this life felt foreign, almost fragile. But it was real. He felt it in the way Plea glanced up, catching his eye, her smile softening as she held his gaze. She stood, brushing her hands on her pants, and crossed the small space to join him, her steps light against the metal floor. "You're staring," she said, her voice low, teasing as she stopped beside him. Her shoulder brushed his, a fleeting touch that sent a spark through him, and he smirked, tilting his head to look at her. "Can't help it," he said, voice rough but warm. "You clean up nice." She rolled her eyes, but the flush creeping up her neck betrayed her, and he reached out, his fingers grazing her arm, slow and deliberate. Her skin was cool under his touch, smooth now without the mud, and he felt the faint shiver that ran through her, her breath catching as his hand lingered. "You're still hurt," she murmured, her eyes flicking to the bandage on his arm, then back to his face. She stepped closer, her chest nearly brushing his, and her hand lifted, hovering over the wound before settling there, light but firm. Her fingers pressed against the fabric, testing, and he tensed, not from pain but from the heat of her touch, the way it spread through him like fire. "I'm fine," he said, his voice lower now, rougher, his free hand finding her waist, pulling her in just enough to close the gap. The shirt bunched under his grip, and he felt the warmth of her beneath it, steady and alive, her pulse jumping where his thumb brushed her side. She didn't argue, just held his gaze, her violet eyes searching his, deep and unguarded. "You're stubborn," she said, a faint laugh slipping out, her breath warm against his jaw. He grinned, his hand tightening on her waist, pulling her closer until their bodies pressed together, the heat of her sinking into him. "You're one to talk," he shot back, his lips brushing her ear as he spoke, the words a low growl. Her laugh came again, soft and real, and she leaned into him, her forehead resting against his, her hands sliding up his chest, fingers curling into his shirt. The contact was electric, a quiet intimacy that felt louder than the jungle's roar, and he held her there, anchoring her, letting the moment stretch. Tavi's voice broke through, small but insistent. "Jackson, come play." He bounded over, tugging at Jackson's sleeve, Mina trailing behind with a shy grin. Jackson exhaled, a rough chuckle escaping as he pulled back, his hand lingering on Plea's waist before dropping. "All right, kid," he said, ruffling Tavi's hair, the boy's laughter bright and unrestrained. He stepped inside, letting Mina climb on his back, her small arms wrapping around his neck as he pretended to stagger under her weight. "You're heavy," he teased, and she giggled, kicking her legs, her grip tightening. Kalia watched, leaning against the door now, her arms crossed, a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Jackson caught her looking, tossing her a smirk as he wrestled Tavi to the cot, letting the boy win with an exaggerated groan. The kids swarmed him, their laughter filling the small space, and he felt it, the shift, the weight of something new settling into place. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was more. Later, after the kids had collapsed into sleep, their small forms tangled together on the cot, Jackson stepped outside again. The night was quiet, the stars stretching endless overhead, a vastness that once felt suffocating but now seemed possible. Kalia followed, her steps soft, and stopped beside him, her shoulder brushing his again, a tether he didn't need to question. She crossed her arms against the evening chill, the borrowed shirt pulling tight across her chest, and he glanced at her, his hand twitching with the urge to pull her close. "You don't have to keep watching," she said, her voice soft, her eyes on the horizon where the jungle loomed dark and silent. He turned to her, his smirk fading into something steadier. "Habit," he said, but there was no edge to it, just truth. She looked at him, her gaze searching, and he reached for her, his hand sliding to her waist, pulling her in slow, deliberate. She didn't resist, stepping into him, her hands resting on his chest, fingers pressing lightly against the fabric. "And if you stopped?" she asked, her voice quieter now, a challenge wrapped in something softer. He considered it, really considered it, his thumb brushing the curve of her hip, feeling the warmth of her through the shirt. "Maybe I will," he said, his voice low, rough with promise. She exhaled, her forehead resting against his again, her breath mingling with his in the cool night air. "You don't have to keep running," she whispered, her fingers tightening on his shirt, grounding him. He felt it, that anchor, solid and real, and his hands settled at her waist, holding her there, steadying them both. "I know," he said, and for the first time he meant it. The words hung between them, heavy with everything they'd fought through, the jungle, the hunters, the loss, and everything they'd found. His hand slid up, cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, slow and sure. She leaned into it, her eyes closing for a moment, and he felt her relax, the tension melting under his touch. The settlement hummed around them, alive with the sounds of people, of survival, but here, in this quiet corner, it was just them, Jackson and Kalia, two souls who'd clawed their way out of the dark and into something new. He pulled her closer, his lips brushing hers. Not rushed, not desperate, just a quiet claim, a promise sealed in the stillness. She kissed him back, soft and certain, her hands sliding to his shoulders, holding him there. When they parted, her forehead stayed against his, her breath warm on his skin, and he felt it. The future, theirs, stretching out like the stars above. The jungle was still out there, vast and unforgiving, but it didn't matter. Not anymore. Jackson glanced at the sky one last time, then back at her, his hand still on her cheek, her warmth anchoring him. He'd wandered too long, fought too hard, but here, with her, with Tavi and Mina asleep inside, he'd found something worth staying for. A family, a home, and for the first time in his life, he let himself believe it could last.